Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I want to give you my quick thoughts on the War Games in Colour, which is the brand new colorization for Doctor Who. Each year they've been doing a new one. Last year was the Daleks in Colour, this year the War Games in Colour. Now, full disclosure, I've only seen the War Games all the way through once or twice, and that's because I am, in theory, the perfect target audience for this colorization. I am a newer Doctor Who fan who does sometimes struggle with classic Who pacing. That's not to say I don't love many classic Doctor Who stories, I do, but some of the longer ones, like for example the War Games, I do struggle with. So I'm not actually against the idea of colorizing some classic Doctor Who episodes and shortening them a bit. I understand that for some, that's complete sacrilege. The original stories shouldn't be touched, and I completely understand that argument, and luckily the original stories will always be there. But in theory, I'm not against the idea of this. And I have to say, for about the first sort of half of this edit, I was really loving it. I think the colorization job on this one is absolutely beautiful. I had my criticisms of last year's Daleks in Colour. Mainly I felt that they made the Dalek city way too colourful and bright for what is meant to be a sterile city filled with mutants in tanks. I think it's just a way too colourful, way too much, ironically, like the 1965 Cushing film. And I also thought that some of the editing choices were a bit off in the Daleks in Colour. That might also be because I'm a bit more familiar with the story, so more of the edits kind of were more obvious to me. There were a couple of times in this where I felt the edits a little bit, but overall for me, on the whole, I have to say it was a much more smooth experience on the editing front for the most part. I will get to some things that were changed that I wasn't too keen on, but overall I thought, the opening sort of like 45 minutes, because this is a 90-minute edit of a much longer story than that, were pretty solid. There was one scene that I will say I felt like I missed something, where very early on, the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe are basically forced into a truck, and I swear I missed them getting into the truck. But let me back up and actually tell you the plot of this for any of you who have not seen The War Games. The War Games is the final story of the second Doctor, Patrick Troughton, alongside his companions Jamie and Zoe. He lands in what he believes to be 1917 World War I trenches, but turns out to actually be several different time zones collected by a group of aliens to study and then basically use to find the best forms of combat to take over the universe. It is also discovered that one of the people behind this, the War Chief, is a Time Lord, and they use their own modified versions of TARDISes called Sidrats to basically send these humans to different time zones. And this plan is so advanced that the only way that the Doctor can stop it is to summon in the Time Lords, who then exile him to Earth for interfering in the affairs of other planets, along with changing his face forcibly, which is how we get John Pertwee. That's the very basic plot of this episode. And I think for the most part, they did a great job of keeping most of the important stuff intact. I really have always liked the scene where the Doctor impersonates a war camp inspector. I've always thought that's really funny. And Zoe's line about how it just seemed the most convenient way to do it when she bashes that guy's head with the plant pot. Love that. I've always loved Jamie McCrimmon, ever since my first classic Doctor Who story, which was Tomb of the Cybermen, so I'm always happy to see him. But yeah, the story itself really worked for me in this format for the most part, but that's not what you're here to hear me talk about. What you're here to hear me talk about are the changes this makes. And as I said, the colorization I think is mostly phenomenal. I think they're a lot more subtle with a lot of the colorization decisions. Obviously, they really highlight the colours of the clothes. So for example, the redcoats, you can really see the red. The American Civil War uniforms have the accurate colouring that those uniforms would have, both on the Union side and the Confederacy side. And some of the shots of the kind of trenches and the various sort of mountainy, rocky vistas, I think look absolutely fantastic in this colorization. But one of my main issues with this colorization, and it is unfortunately one I had with the Daleks in Colour as well, is the music. More specifically, the mixing of the music with the dialogue, and how the music seems significantly louder than the dialogue, to the point where I had to turn up my computer by quite a bit in order to be able to hear all the dialogue over the top of the music. Now, I know this is a complaint some people have with New Who as well, and I don't really see it with a lot of New Who, but with this, I did feel it. I did feel that the music was intruding, because in many ways, I think a lot of the new tracks that they've made for this are really, really good in isolation, but I do think they sort of detract from some of the atmosphere of these scenes. It almost feels like more of a New Who soundtrack, which doesn't really work with a classic Who story. And in one case, there is quite literally a New Who track that is played at multiple points, which I will get to. But yeah, that's like one of the big issues for me with this, is just the music. But the biggest instance of that comes in relation to the War Chief. Now, as far as I understand it, it has been a fan theory for years that the War Chief in this story is not only another Time Lord who knows the Doctor, but he's also the Master. And in fact, you actually hear, when he gets shot down, spoilers, by the Warlord, a little edit of regeneration sound effects played in the background to imply that he regenerates off screen. But this colorization goes out of its way to essentially verify that fan theory by playing the Saxon Master theme whenever the War Chief is addressed. Now, the first time this happened, I thought, oh, this is a fun little reference to that little fan theory. For the record, I don't really have much of an opinion on the fan theory either way. I think I'd prefer if he wasn't the Master, mainly because I think it makes the universe feel a bit bigger. Like, I don't like the idea that every Time Lord knows each other. But I also am not that against it either. I will say I've always loved the War Chief's performance, and I can totally understand why someone looked at it and went, that kind of sounds and looks like the Master, because it does, and I do understand that. So I can go either way on that. But my issue is, whenever the War Chief is on screen, they play the Saxon Master theme. And the first time they play it, as I said, it's fun. By about the 5th or 6th time, I'm kind of like, okay, I get it. You're referencing that he may be the Master. Cool. But again, that song in particular, and I love that song, I love the Saxon theme, it doesn't fit with a classic Who story. And this kind of exemplifies a lot of my issues with the sort of second half of this. When the Time Lords start getting involved and more of the plot sort of starts to become revealed, several changes are made to bring the story more in line with New Who. And what I mean by that is, for example, you get the scene where the Doctor is on trial for interfering, and in the original scene, the Time Lords give him an option to change his appearance, and they show various pictures on the wall of who he could turn into. In this version, they changed that so that the pictures he sees on the screens are his future incarnations as we know them. So, for example, Peter Capaldi, Jodie Whittaker, and I think David Tennant as well. My issue with this is not so much that they did it, but I don't think the execution is great. Now, as I said, I will praise the editing in this one quite a bit in the opening segments, but I don't think this looks particularly great. Equally, there's a lot of new shots of Gallifrey added in. I think some of them are reused from Series 9 and others are new. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I think it does feel jarring when you're going from this super HD footage of Gallifrey and then into the story, which is very much not HD. And I think I would have just preferred if they didn't have those shots in that. I don't mind the scene where the Gallifreyan Citadel appears on the Doctor's TARDIS monitor, but I think all the extra shots of Gallifrey aren't really that necessary. One thing I do want to give praise to, though, in terms of the effects of this, is the model shots and the model work. I think the shots of the TARDIS being pulled back in by the Time Lords as the Doctor tries to escape look absolutely phenomenal, as does the kind of base of operations for the aliens controlling the war games themselves. That all looks great. We also get a new version of the regeneration of the Second Doctor into the Third Doctor, which, as far as I can tell, is basically the same as the edit done by Confession Dial on YouTube. I believe this was also done by Confession Dial, which is a good edit and I enjoy it, don't get me wrong, but I think part of the magic of that was taken away from me by the fact that I've already seen that edit. But I am very glad that Confession Dial got the opportunity. They seem lovely and I'm happy for them. I think my issue with this edit to its core, and I think it's something that I felt with the Daleks in colour as well, is I think there is a market for shortened down Classic Who, which might be sacrilege to some. I know to some the idea of that is terrible. I think there's a market for that, and I think there is even a market for colorised Doctor Who as well. I don't think there's a market for Classic Who that's trying to be made as though it is New Who. When you put New Who music into Classic Who, in my opinion, it doesn't really work, because New Who was built with those bombastic themes in mind. Classic Who wasn't. Classic Who has a very particular atmosphere and tone to it that I just don't think is complemented by the more modern soundtracks at all. And I think this comes to like the root of my problem with the approach that they've taken with these colorizations. As much as I think there's a lot to like in these, and I really do appreciate the craft of them, I love Classic Who because it's Classic Who. I love New Who because it's New Who. I don't need it all to feel the same. I have this same issue in New Who, where I feel that sometimes New Who is too reliant on its classic counterpart, and it's kind of the reverse in this case, where it feels like the editors and the people who are behind these colorizations are kind of relying on these New Whoisms to kind of appeal to younger people who perhaps haven't seen as much classic Doctor Who, and I don't think you need to. I think the stories can speak for themselves, but I guess if I could use a comparison, the collection box sets, which are a very similar sort of release to these, feel like classic Doctor Who, just with some modern additions, quality of life improvements, essentially, whereas with these, they feel a lot more heavy-handed in trying to make them fall into line with new Doctor Who, and I just don't think it works. You feel the contrast really heavily as you're watching it. All of this is to basically say that I think going forward, if they are to do more of these colorizations, which I hope they do because I think each one has gotten better than the last, they need to just let classic Who be classic Doctor Who when they're doing them. Do the colorizations, do the new model shots in FX, you can even make cuts for the sake of accessibility. But I don't really see the need to add New Who music, or add in New Who shots of Gallifrey, or add in pictures of future Doctors from publicity images. I think even that would work better if they were just drawings of the future Doctors rather than literally just the publicity images of the Doctors. I think the problem is, because I'm someone who uses those images all the time for YouTube purposes and thumbnails and all that sort of stuff, I saw the exact editing techniques used to put those pictures there, and it took me out of the experience. As someone who's done those types of fan edits before, I know the basics of how those things are done, but of course, if you weren't a fan of this colorization, the original story is still there. I still think that there was a lot to enjoy in this version. I think the colorization job itself was really, really good. I think the edit, for the most part, was solid. I think it's just adding in the New Who music and adding in the Doctors on the screen and having the Saxon Master play 6 times just feels unnecessary, and I don't think it needs it. But what were your thoughts on the War Games in Colour? Let me know down in the comments below. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you're new, Merry Christmas Eve probably by the time you see this, and I will see you later.